back to the wellness effect. Medical emergencies can happen at any given time, and that is why having someone with first aid training could potentially save lives. To tell us more is Rene Schoeman. Rene, you've mentioned to me that you were in the accounts department and now you're in the medical space. Could you maybe tell us about your journey?
Well, I fell into a career in administration and accounting as a young person, fresh out of school. I kind of fell into that career. And although I was good at it, I didn't enjoy it very much. And as part of my training that I had at Technicon, I did first aid. And although I never finished that course, I did finish the first aid and kind of fell in love with it and continued to keep my credentials up to date throughout the years and was always the first aider or part of the first aid team at the companies I worked for. And yeah, became the love of my life. And yeah, I got called to a site
Yeah.
where we had an emergency and one of our guys had fallen off a roof and he had injured himself, broken an arm. And I rushed out to do the first aid and stabilize his limb and take him to the hospital. And I realized that I'd much prefer to do that than sit in an office and work all day.
Sure.
So yeah, that's how I swapped from corporate to medical.
That's an incredible journey, and thanks for sharing it with us. And why do you believe that, first aid is really important?
First aid to me is the ability to help someone,
Mm.
the knowledge to assist someone when they're having either a really bad day or just in a super traumatic position. And you can be the difference in somebody's life. You can be the stabilizing factor in a very scary situation for
Yeah.
them. And being that person and having the ability to do that for someone is an extraordinary thing. And
Mm.
it's it's amazing. Where else can you have such an impact on someone's life
Mm.
by just having basic knowledge?
Yeah.
Just basic first aid is all you need to be able to impact someone's life like that.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, having the basics can potentially save someone's life. But what are some of those basics that, everyone should know when it comes to first aid?
Okay, so CPR is vitally important. It's a very important thing, I think. Obviously, choking, the Heimlich maneuver, that's also quite important. And I also feel like the basics of stopping bleeding,
Sure.
immobilizing limbs, that, people break limbs and it takes time for an ambulance to get there.
Mm.
You're looking at 10 minutes if the ambulance is nearby. So whatever you can do to help that person in that space is quite important and
Mm.
can make a big impact.
I remember when I was 15, I did my first aid course, then 18 and 21, and I'm sitting here with you and I'm thinking I need to go and do a refresher. But how old should you be um, to learn about first aid training? Is there like an age restriction or is it open to anyone?
I think you should be old enough to understand an emergency.
Sure.
So I think the earlier you are introduced to it, the better it can be.
Mm.
My daughter kind of learned the basics from me. When I was 27, I was diagnosed with a heart condition and I was in and out of ICU. And it was quite a lengthy process before they finally diagnosed me, but I would have fainting spells and things like that. So
Mm.
I felt like I needed to prepare her in a sense for in case she finds me unconscious, what to do. You can teach your kids quite a bit of, who to call. Who do you call?
Mm.
Is there a neighbor nearby who is, around should something happen during the day? Who do you call during the night? Do you have security that you can call? Some security systems have an ambulance button, some have a fire button. So the basics of how to deal with an emergency should be dealt with quite early, I think, with kids in particular, because sometimes things happen and a kid has to make the phone call. And do
Yes.
they know who to call and where's the number? Is
Sure.
it available and accessible to them? So those things I find are quite important. But first aid, I think in particular, should be done at a older age, I think, where they
Sure.
can understand and have the physical strength to do the CPR. Um, I don't know if there's an age limit because people are stronger at different ages. So I think if you know your child and what they're capable of, I think it's up to you as a parent. You'll know best if your kid is capable and has the physical strength to do CPR or to help someone who's choking and things like that. But having the basics of like how to stop bleeding and things like that, that doesn't necessarily need to be taught through first aid. That's just life skills that you could
Yes.
be teaching your kid.
Yeah.
Apply pressure, you know, clean the wound, close the wound.
So what's the difference between a first aider and a medic?
Okay, so a first aider gets basic skills to immobilize, to stop bleeding, to immobilize limbs, to do CPR, and things like that. And then depending on whether you're doing level 1, 2, or 3, that you learn more about those basic things. As a medic, you obviously go that step further, where you are trained in anatomy, you go into it quite deep and and obviously you have the equipment. If your ambulance is equipped with everything you need, you've got, everything that you could possibly think of is in your ambulance to be able to stabilize a patient. So as a medic, you don't make a diagnosis, but you are able to suspect a diagnosis. And according to what you've gotten from your patient, the history and their medical history and things like that, you assess your patient, whether it be a trauma or a medical call, and you go from there. And then depending on what level of medic you are, you then treat the patient. So if it's basic life support is different to intermediate life support or advanced life support. We each have a scope of practice, so we can only go that far.
Okay.
And if the emergency or the patient needs more than what you are able to do in your practice, the person above you or the more qualified person then takes over. It becomes their patient. And then obviously if advanced life support is required, they then get called in.
Okay.
So
Thank
those
you.
are your guys in the response vehicles.
Yes. Yeah.
So you'll only have BLS and ILS on ambulances.
What's a BLS and ILS?
So BLS is basic life support,
Okay.
ILS is intermediate life support,
Okay.
and ALS advanced
Okay.
life support. Yeah.
So maybe explain what's the difference between a medical emergency and a trauma.
Okay, so a trauma would be when something happens, like a vehicle accident, someone falling,
Okay.
like the example I gave you, someone
Yes.
fell off the roof. That's a trauma. So something physically happened to cause an injury. A medical emergency, you're not necessarily going to see something obvious.
Yes.
So someone is maybe found unconscious, someone has a seizure or something like that. They are complaining about internal abdomen pain or that would be considered a medical emergency.
Okay, I see. Okay, so maybe take us through initial steps that one would go through if they're dealing with choking or someone falling off a ladder.
Okay, if someone is choking, it's always your ABCs.
Okay.
So it's your airway, breathing, and circulation. So that's how they teach you in first aid, and it's also something that carries on in a medical field. Is you always start with your airway, breathing, and circulation, no matter what you're doing. So if a person is choking, you need to see if you can dislodge what they're choking on. And it also depends on how, badly they're choking. If you cannot dislodge whatever is in their throat, you need to then, it's hard to explain verbally, but you need to find the solar plexus. It's just where the ribs are joined,
Yes.
just below the sternum. And that's where you want to apply
Pressure.
strong, forceful pressure,
Okay.
because you want to kind of have them huff out. So if they're not huffing out, it's not going to work. So you need to give a strong upward pull with the Heimlich to force air out of the lungs, to make compression through the esophagus, to force whatever is choking the person out.
Thank you for that. So it's airway, breathing, circulation. All right, there you have it, ABCs.
Yes.
And I mentioned to you that I did my last first aid training, I think I was 21. So how often should one update their first aid training?
It used to be every 2 years, but now it's annually.
Okay.
Yeah, so to remain qualified, you need to do your first aid annually.
And where can people find, professionals that provide the services? On Google?
You would find a tremendous amount of people who are paramedics and people who are in the medical field who do first aid courses. Some of the private services, ambulance services, also do first aid training. I know you can do it. There's so many schools around. It's absolutely easily accessible.
And you mentioned in this conversation that almost the turning point for you in almost changing your career trajectory is when you went on site and an individual had fallen. Could you take us through how first aid helped you in that specific scenario?
Well, it's because you have that knowledge, it gives you a little bit of an edge to keep calm. So when you approach an emergency situation where someone is injured, the main thing is to keep calm, take control of the situation. You don't want to walk into a situation where you yourself are not safe. So the first thing you have to consider is your own safety, because if you walk into a dangerous situation or potentially dangerous situation, if you get injured, how are you going to help that person? So your own safety has to be a consideration. And then also, you don't want a crowd of people around a person who's been injured. So taking control of the situation and asking people to step back, and then having, being in control enough to select an individual and tell them, phone the emergency services. Don't just scream out into the crowd, someone call an ambulance, because everyone's going to be, look, who's someone. So you need to look someone in the eye and say, you please call emergency services and get things rolling, because you want to be making that call before doing anything else. And that person who's making the call can be standing next to you, because while they're making the call, you're going to be assessing what is wrong with the person that needs treatment or who's hurt themselves. And be figuring out how you can help them. And that information is vital to be passed on to emergency services through the person making the phone call. So you're going to be speaking to the person who's potentially on the ground and saying to that person, what's your name? I'm a first aider. May I help you? Getting permission to help a person, that's also quite important. You can't just walk in, I'm a first aider, I'm going to help you. You need the person's permission. So even as a medic, you need permission to treat a person. That's part of the ethics of doing the job as well. So you need to get information. What's the person's name? How old are they? Do they have any existing medical conditions? What led to them being on the ground at the moment? Did they trip and fall? Did they fall off a ladder? Did they feel faint and lose consciousness? All of those things can be vital information for emergency services as they arrive, that they have that information and can immediately act accordingly.
Take us to that moment. You jumped into the car, you arrive on the scene. What did you do? Like, take us through step by step.
Well, that was quite a while ago, so
Yeah.
to remember that specific
Or
incident.
you can give us another incident where you utilized your first aid training skill set in a particular situation.
Well, there is an incident that kind of stands out. I was in the office, we were in a meeting in the boardroom, and I got called by the receptionist and told that there had been an accident outside of the building.
Yes.
And I grabbed my first aid kit, went out the door, and there was a whole crowd of staff who had assembled because something had happened. And what had happened is that one of the gentlemen had been busy in his vehicle getting his things ready, and had one of the vehicles came past, clipped his door that was open, and he got trapped between the two vehicles and the door.
Oh no.
And it, crushed his arm. So obviously they'd taken him out already when they called me, but I obviously took a look at the arm. There was no bleeding, but you could see where the vehicle had compressed the limb. So to me, that screamed a whole bunch of things. There's potentially a break there. There's potentially internal damage. That compression looked like, you never want something to get squeezed, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong with it. The nerves can die, the muscle can die because there's no circulation. So, it just depends on the situation. So every situation you find yourself in is different. There's never going to be, oh, this is exactly the same as last time. It's never like that. It can. So you just have to approach the situation with a clear head, keep what you know in your head, take control of the situation, keep the person calm, control the scene, be the person in charge. Don't be afraid to be forceful and make your voice heard, and tell everyone, okay, everyone, go inside now. This is not a sideshow. Off you go, back to work. And I kept one person who seemed calm, who seemed in control with me. And she was the person I said to, okay, go make the call to emergency services. We need them to come. And she was the person who assisted me as well. And I said to her, okay, can you go get me some water for this guy? He's thirsty and he's going into shock. And, can we get his jacket out of the vehicle? So, because he was feeling cold and things like that, because there's only so much you have in your first aid kit. So, yeah, so I had a lovely splint. It was just like a cardboard splint. It had a nice elbow to it. I put his arm in there, made sure there was no bleeding happening. Put that on, wrapped it up with a bandage, not too tight. Did a sling so that arm was resting in a comfortable position that wasn't painful to him. And we waited for emergency services. And when they came, they took him straight onto the ambulance, assessed him, did everything they needed to do, vitals and things like that, and off he went to the hospital.
Amazing. Rene, thank you so much for sharing your passion with us, but also giving us tangible things that we can implement in our lives.
You're most welcome.
Remember to subscribe so you don't miss out. I'll see you next time on The Wellness Effect. BankMed, the medical scheme of choice for the financial services industry. The Wellness Effect is proudly brought to you by BankMed, yours in good health.